All right, so welcome back, everybody. So the first part of this drawing activity is we're going to draw 4 different textures. We're going to do furry, scaly, bumpy, and I don't know what that is, rough, using pencil. And then we're going to put those together for next week. You're going to put either those 4, you're going to make your own. And use them to create some sort of imaginary creature. You will have time, I'll explain that part later. But for now, you're going to start by just drawing 4 boxes on your paper. So for me, I'm going to just kind of, I'm not a fan of rulers. If you're a fan of rulers, go for it. You can make these boxes a little bigger, but you're really no bigger than like, this is like 2 by 2, 3, and okay, I gotta make them. I'm gonna make my boxes a tiny bit smaller so they all fit on the camera. So about 1 inch is fine, 1.5 inches. Next, I'm going to label them. I do kind of like hair, scales, bumps, and let's do kind of like cracks. So now I have my 4 different textures that I'm going to kind of hone in on as I draw, and I'll start with hair. Let me see if I can zoom in. No, it's not going to let me zoom in. So with hair, there's kind of like two different characteristics of hair that you need to think about. The direction that the fur is going to go in, or the hair, and then how long or short it is. If you're doing a creature that has short hair, the lines are kind of shorter dashes. So I'm going to do kind of a hairy texture for the top half of my swatch. And I'm just doing little kind of curved lines. They're not perfectly straight. They have little flick. There's like a little flick of the wrist, and the flick of the wrist, you can see, creates a little point on your line. So I'm doing little short marks, and I'm kind of building up, and I might even have it kind of poking out the top of the box. And just like how Nate was saying, you can shade your hair too. Like you can put more dashes to make it darker, or you can put less little flicks to make it lighter. So in this example on the left, it's lighter here and it's darker over here, and that's just by having more dashes. So this is like short hair, but if I wanted to do long and flowy hair, I would do that same process, but I would do kind of longer flowy lines coming out. And I haven't done any shading. I'm only using the point of my pencil. I may, if I want to like have a darker shade, I could kind of go in and add a little shading, but it's mostly done using just your pencil. Just the point. And again, it's all about that flick, learning how to do the kind of little flick of your wrist so that it has, so I'm like kind of normal, 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 and then I just flick away to create that pointed top. So I'm gonna pause for a minute. I'll pause the video, and we'll come back in a minute and we'll do scales. So, recording. All right, so we're back. The general feeling of the class is that people are very interested in doing dragons, and so we definitely want to go over how to do things like scales and bumps. The technique for scales and the technique for feathers is very similar. And scales is useful for drawing fish, snakes, dragons, as well as birds and those kind of things, because you can use scales to be feathers, very, very similar. So with scales are made up of, sorry, while I'm demonstrating, it's hard. Birds don't have scales, I know, Nate. I'm gonna show you what I'm talking about in a second. So the pattern for scales, because remember, texture is made through pattern and shading. It's a bunch of U's, and the U's are kind of stacked together in a somewhat layered fashion. So you kind of start with that first layer by just doing a U. And then the second layer kind of connects to the layer before that. And so you're building up these layers. Now, Nate is heckling me about birds don't have scales. So what I do want to show you is there's some variations on scales. So this is one type of scale. The other type of scale has points to it.
I have a question.
Yes, Nate.
The scales, do they get bigger or do they get smaller as you go down as layers?
That is a good question. And it's kind of a personal choice. So like if we look at the example from Maurice Sendak, like they're pretty much the same size. The key thing that changes is like the direction that they're pointing in. So they're pointing down during the body and then they're kind of pointing out around the legs and feet. Going back to the other example of scales, yeah, it's the same artwork. So the scales up here are kind of pointing down and they just, so the question is, no, they don't really get smaller. If anything, they would get smaller like at the edge, like where the edge is, they would get a little tinier. But for the most part, they stay the same size.
All right, thanks.
But it also depends, like, so the idea is, right, like if it's a dragon or like a Gila monster or like some Demogorgon character, like they may not, they're kind of a little random. So randomness is okay. They don't need to be the same size. One can be a little bigger. So like in this one, they get pretty small in some parts. So Nate, the question was, how do we turn scales into feathers? The feather pattern is pretty much the same thing, only it's a little bigger.
Longer in length.
And you can put that little texture in the middle. So it's almost the exact same the exact same technique to create scales and feathers. But the only thing that I'm missing, right? So we've talked about the pattern of scales, but we also need to add shading because texture is made up of both of those things. So the only thing to help make scales look like they're popping out a little bit is to just add a little bit of shading underneath each row of scales. And that just kind of makes it look a little bit more realistic and makes it look like they're kind of like stacked on top of each other. So I'm gonna stop talking and let you work for another minute, and then we'll move over to bumps and cracks.
And how much shading do you need? Like,
you saw that. It's not, I mean, it's just a little dab. So it's just a little bit of shading. If I move it closer, you can see it better. Like, it's just a little implied shading underneath each, where each scale overlaps. So like, it's where when this row ends and the next row begins, there's just a little shadow like right here. And that's how you get it to look like there's kind of like ridges or scales. All right, we're back. I'm going to demonstrate bumps and cracks together so that there's time to also show you how to get started with your mythical creature. So bumps are a little more random. So in both of these two examples, there was kind of like a system to the pattern. Bumps and cracks are a little bit more random, and it's literally like you can just do kind of like little U's, and this is good for like warts on a frog. You can also do kind of like up and down to make them a little pointier, but it's varying how big and how small the bumps are. And then just putting a little bit of shading next to. So I'm gonna do like the right side of every bump. I'll just kind of put a little smidgen of shading, because remember, making texture is all about both pattern and shading. And then the steps for cracks, this is also would be great for doing a dragon or anything like made out of rocks. You're kind of doing the breakup of the cracks is a little bit more random. And then you would just go in and add a little bit of shadow next to each crack.
what do you think the type of pencil that we need? Like HB1, HB, what do you think?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if you got like a box of drawing pencils, HB is very light. And so for shading, you don't want to use an HB. Shading, you want anything from like 2B, which is your standard, anywhere up to 6B. And these are what the higher the number of the B is, the softer the graphite is. So this is good for shading, but for sketching, because it's a very hard pencil, you want anywhere from like HB all the way to like 4H or even like 6H. So these are going to be much lighter. These are going to be darker. And the higher that number is, the darker it is, or the lighter it is. Does that make sense, Nate? So for shading, you want anything from 2B to 6B. I'm gonna pause.